Welcome back. Security stories have been going really well. We've had thousands and thousands of views on a couple of them. So very, very glad that you're enjoying them. I'm going to throw up another one now. This one might not sound like it's your cup of tea, but bear with me because it is interesting. You know, from a psychological perspective, it's interesting. And from a point of view that you might not have been inside this world before, and there will be some sort of things that you maybe didn't realise that are news to you. So bear with it, give me a listen. This is about the gay scene in Brighton. Brighton is down on the south coast of the UK, and it is a very, very heavily gay-centric population. It's probably the gay capital of the UK, if not Europe. I don't know if that's an official thing. But anyway, I was brought up around there. I spent many, many years working there in the club scene. So I had some pretty unusual experiences. And despite the fact that we see all this stuff on the news about, you know, fun and rainbows and everyone having a great time and there's no problems with it at all, I actually saw some of the kind of darker side of the gay scene there, which I'm going to talk about today. And let me get this straight to start with. This isn't about, you know, not liking gays or being anti-gay, homophobic, anything like that. A lot of my friends are gay. I'm very, very cool with anyone's sexuality. I really don't care what their sexuality is. But this was an eye-opener to me, and there was a lot of kind of inside knowledge that I gained that probably most people wouldn't see on a normal day in Brighton. So the first thing to note would be, you know, I worked in a lot of big gay clubs because I was a fairly well-spoken doorman. I wasn't the usual kind of shaven-headed thug with no vocabulary. I was able to hold a pretty articulate conversation, so I was often asked if I would front the doors at these gay venues because they were huge. You know, there had thousands of people going in and out. They had the same security requirements as any other venue, and there was at the time a lack of gay door staff. So that's probably changed these days, but at the time that was how it was. The first thing I came to realise was how judgmental and how prejudiced some of the scene was towards other parts of the scene. You know, we all as outsiders look at this LGBTQ plus movement as one large movement, and that was far from what the truth was. Although that might be what's presented in the media, what I found was that each part of that scene was very, very integral to itself and didn't particularly like the other parts very much. So to give an example, you know, I worked a big gay male club that was basically, its policy was, we want gay men in this club. And they told me in no uncertain terms they did not want lesbians going into the club. They certainly didn't want straight people going into the club. They weren't particularly big fans of anyone that had any other niche sexualities at the time. I found that a bit unusual, so I would kind of let pretty much anyone into the club as long as they were nice people. I got screamed at by the management of the club over that. You know, they were horrified that I was letting lesbians in because as far as they were concerned, you know, they didn't want them in. They just wanted to fill it out with gay guys. So that was kind of the first eye-opener to me. The next part, which I found out very quickly, was this idea that, you know, all the gay people are super nice and super kind. The first club I worked at, I went there, the manager of the place was very, very camp, immediately started kind of propositioning me, being very inappropriate. I said, look, you know, I'm not interested. And he wanted to know whether I was gay, what sexuality I was and all that. And I said, look, it doesn't matter. It's none of anyone's business. My sexuality shouldn't have any bearing on what I'm providing here, which is just a professional job. So at that point, you would think I'd made myself pretty clear. A bit later in the evening, I then find this guy is approaching me from behind while I'm doing something with the radios. Then he basically comes up, puts his arms either side, and as I turn around, you know, he's trying it on with me. So I push him away and say, look, man, I'm not interested. He then gets very angry and actually threatens me and suggests that he might threaten my job if I'm not going to go along with his ideas of what I should be doing, which was obviously to have some sort of relationship with him. which I just straight up said, look, do what you want, but that's never going to happen. I'm in a relationship right now, and even if I wasn't in a relationship, I certainly wouldn't be having one with you, no matter what my sexuality, just because I don't think you're a particularly nice person. So he was very, very annoyed, but as it happened, he didn't really have anyone else that could run the security for him at the time, so I was kept in the position. I then later on got told by this guy that he absolutely abhorred drugs. You know, he didn't want any drugs in the venue, so he told me. And I said, yeah, that's fine. You know, I was open to whatever the management wanted. Some management wanted venues to have a very lax policy on the door to people coming in and out, i.e. don't search people. Some places wanted me to have a very strict policy on who came in and out and search people and make sure that they weren't bringing anything in. That's fine. I didn't really care. That was up to the venue. So we had a big night coming up. I think it was a gay pride event, and he said he wanted everyone on the door searched for drugs. And he specifically wanted everyone searched for a substance called GHB, which is like an odourless, flavourless liquid, which I understand could be drunk in small quantities and used to kind of get a bit inebriated, and apparently it makes the act of sex a bit more interesting. But it could also be used in larger quantities as potentially a date rape drug. So that's obviously a bit of a problem. You know, it's not something you particularly want in the club. The issue I had was that there was another liquid substance that was bought regularly into gay clubs, especially the one I was working at, and this was amyl nitrate or poppers. And that was a very, very highly scented product that if you smelt it, it basically dilates all your blood vessels. The gay males were using this amyl nitrate as some sort of sexual enhancement because it dilates blood vessels, so it doesn't take a brain of Britain to work that part out. But it also gives you a kind of a funny feeling. So, you know, they were using it as a kind of party drug as well. The problem I had was the only way I could ascertain that they were okay with the poppers amyl nitrate coming in, because that was perfectly legal at the time, but they weren't okay with GHB coming in. And the management said, well, just have a quick smell of the vial, and if it doesn't smell of anything, then it's banned. You can't let that vial in, and you can't let the person in. If it's amyl nitrate, they can come in. So I remember that night I'd smelt about 4 or 5 of these things coming in, and they all had a really strong smell to them. And my face was completely red at that time. I could hardly see straight. And I was like, this is not going to work, you know. So I had to go back to the management and say, look, you know, I'm going to die if I'm just smelling these random bottles as they come in, because I'm already feel super ill. I'm guessing that some people enjoyed that feeling, but it wasn't great for me at all. And I should add that that night as well, we must have taken drugs off pretty much every single guy that came to that club. You know, I've worked in a lot of nightclubs, and obviously I've confiscated drugs off people and flushed them down toilets and whatever. But this was the club that had the most drugs I've ever seen in my life. I had like a carrier bag of wraps of drugs by the end of about 3 hours of letting people in on the door, which I then, you know, gave to the management for them to dispose of. Whatever they did with that, I have no idea. And at the end of the night on that dance floor, it was literally like walking through autumn leaves. You know, you were kicking all these tiny little empty plastic bags, and those empty plastic bags were in fact, you know, the old wraps that I hadn't found, that people had managed to get into the club and had taken in there and just discarded onto the floor. So it was absolutely rife with drugs in that place. And I've got to say, most of the male gay venues I worked in were exactly the same. The drug taking was unbelievable. And the police really didn't care. You know, if that had been a straight club, it would have had a terrible reputation. The police would have been really on its case. But the police literally took a completely different attitude when it was gay clubs in Brighton. They had no issues with anything going on there at all. As far as they were concerned, you know, the gay community could do whatever they liked, and no one was going to be hauled over the coals for it. The manager who told me he was anti-drugs, by the way, and had sort of tried it on with me a couple of times by now, and he was really, really repulsive. I ended up walking into his office unannounced, and I found him face down in a big mound of white powder, like a sort of Audi Lidl version of Scarface, and he still proceeded to tell me he was anti-drugs, but not on this particular night where he had partaken in some huge pile of white powder, whatever that may have been. So he was, he was just gross all round, to be fair. Now we come to possibly the darker and more interesting part of this, and the kind of bit that really had me thinking in psychological terms. There was an area of Brighton known as Duke's Mount, and that was out on the seafront. And this area was notorious for people going there and using it as a kind of open air sex spot. I think they called it cottaging, the community there. So it was basically guys would go there, hang around near the bushes, kind of waiting for other guys to turn up and then meeting them for sex in that area. The police left that area well alone. They didn't bother with it. And it was kind of widely accepted that that practice went on. Everyone in Brighton knew that, if you were a straight person, don't go to that area at night. And if you do, kind of expect to see some eyebrow raising stuff. Now, interestingly, I was working down on the beach, and I had a couple of door guys working for me that had to walk through that way to get to work. Well, that was the quickest route for them. People tried there to grab hold of them and actually assault them and sexually assault them on the way to work. And luckily, the door guys could handle themselves, so they'd end up defending themselves and beating these guys up. But it was like 2 or 3 guys trying to grab hold of them. So that was not something that I kind of expected. That was far removed from this kind of happy rainbow flag waving thing that everyone kind of thinks about Brighton. This was now getting into some real dark stuff. Later on in life, I then went on to work for a little while as a carer, and I worked for an elderly gentleman who was a doctor. He was actually an eminent psychotherapist, very, very intelligent man, fascinating guy. Also happened to be gay, and he told me about some of his experiences in Brighton, and he actually brought up Duke's Mount and said that he used to go there when he was a little bit younger. He went there for a very specific reason, and he would go there to get beaten up and to have an encounter of a sexual nature. And I was like, beaten up, what would be going on there? So as it turned out, you would get a lot of young men come to Brighton that were kind of closet gays, and they were making up for being, a closet gay by being quite aggressive and displaying like an outwardly sort of masculine presence, quite violent, often quite homophobic. I met a lot of these guys that would turn up on the doors. They would want to come into the gay clubs, but at the same time they were saying things that were, horrible about gay people. So you'd think, well, why do you want to come in a club if you hate gay people so much? And it was clearly because they had kind of suppressed gay urges that they were, for whatever reason, unable to act on, and therefore they were kind of stuck in this limbo of hating themselves, hating the gay community, but at the same time being drawn to that. So you would get these types being drawn down to Duke's Mount. Then you would get guys like the doctor I looked after. He would go down there, of a well-to-do older gentleman. He would go down and offer these young guys money. The young guys would kind of want the money, because they weren't often from the greatest of backgrounds. They would violently assault the doctor, take some money off him, and they would also take part in a sexual act with him. So they would often assault him after the sexual act had happened. So it was kind of like a prostitution scenario where a sex act occurred, some payment occurred, and then a beating occurred. And I said to him, well, surely, you wouldn't want to get beaten up all the time. And he said, no, I actually quite enjoyed that part. He liked the risky part of it. And he also said that because of his experiences as a younger man, I think he had been in a school where the people had sort of hit the boys, and also there was a lot of gay stuff going on at that school, and the teachers were whacking these boys over the bum and all this kind of thing, that those two things became kind of grossly linked together, and this act of violence combined with this sort of illicit gay sex had become something that was very exciting to him. And I said, well, that sounds pretty niche. And he said, oh no, far from it. He said, this is actually You know, there's a community of people out there that partake in this, and they all go to that place for that very same reason, that they want to have this kind of very risky situation occur where they may or may not get hurt, where they may or may not have a sexual encounter, and where they may or may not get robbed. And he even said, you know, they all went there only with a certain amount of money in their pocket because they kind of expected to have it taken from them, and they also expected to suffer some sort of violent confrontation, but that was all part of the fun and games apparently. So that was a kind of eye-opener for me, that I never really thought that there were people like that were in a large group specifically looking for those kind of encounters. Kind of the worst thing I ever heard about Brighton was from my friend that worked in a hospital there, and his job doing security was kind of to look after some of the staff, to make sure things weren't getting stolen, you know, keeping an eye on drugs, movement of drugs and all that kind of thing, because obviously there's a lot of drug addicts around. They were trying to get hold of some of the drugs that could be abused. But he came back and told me a pretty shocking story, which he said was happening regularly at the hospital. So at the time there was a bunch of HIV drugs made available, and these were kind of groundbreaking treatments that were like almost a morning after pill for, you know, the prevention of HIV. So if you had some sort of risky sexual encounter, you could go to the hospital, they would administer this cocktail of drugs which would in effect prevent you from becoming HIV positive. There were guys that were engaging in risky sex on purpose. There would be a group of guys who they would invite someone that they knew to be HIV positive so that they could all engage in risky sex together, and then they would go to hospital in the morning to have a kind of party where they would basically turn up quite gleeful asking for this cocktail of drugs. Now that's pretty weird and perverse in and of itself, but then you have to consider the reason my friend knew about it was because he had to escort the doctors down to the cabinet where these drugs were kept and escort them back again, because that cocktail of drugs cost thousands and thousands of pounds for each single administration, because it was new on the market and because obviously it's quite a groundbreaking set of drugs, that they were charging huge amounts of money for it. And of course in the UK this is all NHS, you know, taxpayer funded, so the taxpayer was in effect funding regular occurrences of these kind of risky parties that these guys were having, and they even had certain names for it. You know, it was so commonplace there that there was a name for these parties, that they would all go there and attempt to get infected with HIV so that they could then go and administer this drug treatment the next day. And there seems to be that vein running through a lot of this stuff, is that there was all this element of risk involved, and that kind of got these guys very, very sexually excited. I've never understood that. You know, the last thing I want in terms of my sex life is any sort of element of health risk. I actively try and avoid that. You know, if when I've dated girls and stuff, the last thing I want to do is think that I could be getting an STD. That would not make me think that I was having a good evening. In fact, I would steer way clear of anyone that I thought that about. I'm a germaphobe pretty much, so I can't imagine anything worse than going to a party and inviting someone who definitely has a sexually transmitted disease. It sounds terrible. And last but not least, it was the sheer amount of sexual attacks on males, both full-on rape and then just random sex attacks. I mean, I could have argued that I was certainly grabbed multiple times whilst I worked by people that I didn't want grabbing me, and they just thought it was a huge joke. Now, you know, I'm a pretty big guy. I'm not too bothered about that. I'm not whining about it. You know, I worked in that environment. Some people grabbed hold of me and I told them to get lost and shoved them away, and a couple of them I kicked out. You know, that's as it may be. But, you know, there was a darker side to that, that unfortunately there was a lot of males in Brighton that were, you know, seriously assaulted, sexually assaulted and raped, and that very little of that was ever spoken about. It was never known about in the news, taking into account that Brighton was pretty much run by a gay sort of council. All the political figures in that area were gay, so the gay community had full control over all the stuff that went out in the tabloids, and there was never any mention of any of this stuff. And it kind of annoys me a little bit that they get painted as this sort of very happy community down there, when you're glossing over the fact that there was some very, very unpleasant behaviour going on that no one wanted to discuss. I'm discussing it here because I like to expose the truth about things. You know, like everything in life, there's good and bad. You know, there's a wonderful side of the gay community that were all happy, good people. Then there was a very dark side of that community that were judgmental, prejudiced. In fact, some of them were more prejudiced than a lot of the prejudiced straight people that I've come across. They were even prejudiced, like I mentioned before, against other members of the gay community for various different reasons. Very, very catty indeed. So that there was this dark side, and then there was the glossing over of some of these things which were actually very serious crimes. There was even the number of deaths in the area that were, to me, linked to that kind of behaviour that I've just been talking about, that were pretty much, you know, kept out of the media. There were small mentions of these things happening, and nothing was really done about it. I certainly never read about anyone being prosecuted. Whether or not they were, I don't know. But, you know, that bothered me a lot at the time, that there seemed to be this kind of get out of jail free card. You know, if you strapped a rainbow flag on and kind of put some body glitter on and pranced about in a pair of short shorts, you could pretty much break numerous different laws, some of them incredibly serious, and no one really cared about it. And if you'd have done that as a straight white male, you would have been going to prison for like 20 years. I mean, even walking down the street smoking a joint in the UK at the time as a straight white male, you would have pretty much been arrested and at least gone for a jail cell for that night, and then had a court case over it and probably a big fine, and then put that into reverse. In Brighton, you could have, if you were gay, you could have walked around doing pretty much anything you wanted and no one would have batted an eyelid. So it was a great place to live, don't get me wrong. I enjoyed working there. I met many good people at the clubs, but the reason I make this video is to kind of open people's eyes a bit to the fact that in all different parts of human nature and human interaction, there's good and bad. There is no completely pure and good group within the population. All the different groups have a mixture of good, bad and everything in the middle. Guys, I hope you were able to listen to that without too much judgment. I recognise on YouTube I get a lot of comments about, you know, I did a thing on the security stories before about I'd done a strip thing, and people were saying, oh, that's gay and whatever. It's 2024. Get over yourselves. You know, it's not a big deal. If people want to be gay, let them be gay. If adults want to do whatever they want to do with other adults, I've got no issue with that. I do start taking an issue when they try and thrust it upon everyone, and whatever sexuality you are, you know, to me, that's kind of a personal thing. I wouldn't go around shouting about my own sexuality from the rooftops and making a big scene about it. And I think that they're getting more into the attention-seeking part there. So I wouldn't say I disliked anyone because of their sexuality, but I certainly don't like attention-seeking, screamy, annoying people. And that would be a large section of those people that we often see on social media. So I'm not a big fan of them, but it's got nothing to do with their sexuality or their gender, or whether they're trans or not. It's to do with the fact that they are just super annoying people, and I don't like attention seekers. So if you know, apparently that makes me whateverist, that's fine. I hold my hands up. I'm attention seekerist. Guys, have a great time. I hope you found that of some interest. Take care. Catch you next time.